everyone, and welcome to MOA Live Talks. Once again, I'm Dr. Heather Hatch. So thank you to anyone who may be joining me today for a very exciting topic. I forgot to close my door, so my dog is here. Very sorry. So today our topic is the history of archaeological thought. Sorry. So I wanted to talk about this today to give people sort of an idea of how that's changed over time, so that people can understand that the way that archaeologists think about things aren't static, that it has changed over time and is continuing to change. So I just want to give you this history so that you can get a little bit of an idea of sort of where we're coming from, why you see certain interpretations in museums, and how that information gets presented to the public. As per usual, I am going to try and put a link to our donations page up here in a second on the live stream once it gets to me. And sorry, this is slightly more chaotic here than usual today. There we go. Apparently I'm commenting with our donations page as myself, but that's fine. So I left that there. Once again, if anybody has been appreciating these talks, if you find them interesting and informative, then please feel free to drop a donation to the museum. Like I said, this is a very general talk just to give some context about how archaeology as a discipline has changed over time. I'm not going to focus on the names of different scholars who are associated with these ideas, partly for time and partly because I think it's just going to get really overwhelming if I do. It's probably going to be a lot to take in anyway, so if anybody is actually paying attention through all of this, congratulations. As ever, if you do have any questions, please leave a comment and we will get back to you. So I'm going to I'm going to focus on theory, but I am going to throw in a few comments about methodology as well, where they're relevant. So also, again, like, people write whole books on this stuff. They teach like full year courses on this subject. So we're really just sort of skimming our fingers across the surface of this topic today. But I do think it's important for people to have an opportunity to bring some of that knowledge of the background of archaeology when you're trying to understand the things that we're presenting as a museum and these talks and so on and so forth. So also, we're going to be mainly looking at North America, mainly. So in the UK and in Europe, there's a slightly different trajectory. They're really by like the 70s, 90s, like through 90s, that period. Pretty much the schools of thought are communicating more internationally. I will talk a little bit about this as well. And it's partly, this discrepancy is partly because of the history of the disciplines. So in North America, archaeology has always been much more closely tied to anthropology and more influenced by anthropological theory. In the UK, there's the influence of classical history, so they have there's a tradition of people being interested in written history and the material objects that are associated with like ancient Rome and Greece and so forth. And there's also a very close tie to the natural sciences, so like geology and biology and so forth. And these differences, these different ties, really did have an influence on how people were trying to interpret the remains of past human cultures and even on what kinds of questions that people were trying to answer. So what I really want people to get out of this is a sense of how things change and a recognition that things are still changing and are going to continue to when it comes to how we gather and interpret evidence of past human activity. So there's a couple of themes also that I've tried to sort of pepper through this, but just to make you aware of that. The first is the idea of professionalization. So who is doing archaeology, why, as well as how it's being done. The second is the question of authority. So how knowledge or the perception of it can reinforce power structures. So whose input is being given in any attention when it comes to looking at trying to answer questions about the past. So what is the basis for this authority? Is it coming from education, from experience, from particular methodology, or is it coming from somewhere else? And then there's just a few other little things that I wanted to point out before we really dive into this topic. So the first is that these schools of thought that I'm talking about, like when they're dominant, it's always just a trend. There's never a point in time where everyone believes the same thing, or is it taking the same approach. There's often competing schools of thought, and there's always conversation or dialogue between them that leads to new ways of thinking, new ideas, and new knowledge. So the second thing is that in a lot of ways, the dominance of these schools of thought is cyclic. So new scholars will reject the knowledge of their teachers, the previous generation, but then they'll pull in the things from the people that their teachers were rejecting, right? So, but they'll reinterpret them and refine them and say, well, maybe this idea was dumb or was bad or racist, but we're going to pull that nonsense out and try and bring in something that's useful still out of this perspective. So even early schools of thought that were once completely out of fashion can come back with sort of a more nuanced understanding and still provide some new insights, right? And this is because we're always learning more, so we're able to recognize greater complexity in the context that we're examining. We also have more materials and more examples to draw from when formulating and investigating different theories. So this like I said, there's this question of authority, there's this question of like cyclical knowledge, and there's always a discourse and always competing schools of thought about how we interpret different kinds of archaeological knowledge. So these days, I would say that there is more openness and flexibility to the application of archaeological theory. So there's greater recognition that there is value in different perspectives, both within and external to the discipline. But how we've gotten to that point is really a matter of this history that I'm going to talk about. So let's get into it. All right, so the first thing I'm going to open with is Antiquarianism. There we go. So this comes out of really very early interest in the past and in peoples of the past. So like even early in 19th century and even before that. So it's not really a school of thought per se. It's really best described as sort of a movement predominantly of affluent white men who want to own pieces of history, whether it because they find it legitimately interesting or they're trying to make themselves look cultured in association with these objects of culture. So deservedly or not, they want to have their opinions as well as their collections valued and respected. So they're trying to capture some of the glamour of exploration and discovery, and these are people who went around collecting curios, either by digging up archaeological sites, including grave sites, although some of them did obtain their collections secondhand. So they were absolutely good scholars among this antiquarian group, and people who produced contributions that we still in some ways find valuable. But for the most part, these are people who wanted to own interesting and exotic trinkets. So it wasn't really about valuing knowledge of the past, it was about their own prestige, really, as much as anything else. So their methodology was also pretty lax, so mostly it was literally digging around known or potential sites with no real systematic method, other than trying to locate the materials or the locations of materials of particular interest. So they might sort of say, well, I know that we might find neat stuff over in these kinds of places, so let's dig here. They weren't even really recording anything other than very broadly. So this attitude towards archaeological remains absolutely does persist to this day. But it's not really an accepted academic approach. We're much less understanding in the modern area, and we would really just call these people looters. Sorry, my dog is back. This is making everything shake. Okay. It's a very selfish approach. So people who want to feel this thrill of discovery and claim the prestige of owning an object, but who don't really respect how destructive this approach to recovery is and how much it actually compromises our ability to understand the past. Okay. So out of this early approach, though, we do start to get people who are really doing what we would consider to be archaeology instead of just looting or collecting or whatever. So it's still mostly white men who have the leisure and time to pursue this kind of interests, but they are interested in trying to figure out what's happening on archaeological sites, and they're starting to develop more rigorous methodology, so recording where things come from on sites, creating maps, and taking more extensive notes. We also start to get the idea of sort of digging in trenches, so a little bit more systematic, and the use of more specialized tools like trowels and brushes for more careful recovery of some objects. So there were two early, really identifiable schools of thought. The first of which I'm going to talk about is called cultural evolutionism. So in its initial form, it was the idea that cultures move from a more primitive to a more civilized state over time. And so this is a very 19th century concept of evolution and social evolution that perceived cultural change as a linear progression. So in North America, early archaeologists were really primarily interested in indigenous sites, and they were trying to understand what had happened to the people who had built some of the monumental structures and like mounds and so forth that they found on the landscape. So they couldn't accept that the cultures whose people who had once built these kinds of things and lived in cities and whatnot could be related to people who lived in smaller or non-permanent settlements that were on that landscape in their time. So also there was this idea that went along with this, that if they could demonstrate that there had been some kind of break between the people who had these obvious like marks of civilization as they saw them and contemporary indigenous peoples, it would justify all kinds of really like bad colonial behavior by saying that the people who were on the land that they wanted to take, for example, weren't really the original population, and since the original people were gone, it was okay for them to come in and take it for themselves. So basically a lot of this was used to justify a colonial expansion. And there was a lot of other problems with early iterations of cultural evolution. It was really quite problematic in terms of how it viewed not only peoples of the past, but like contemporary peoples as well. However, this idea that cultures can change over time and that you can trace these changes in the archaeological record was and continues to be an important contribution. So if you strip out all of the everything else, like there's still some seeds of good ideas in there. The other early school of thought was what we call the culture historical approach. And this is really, it's also linked to a theory or lumped in with an idea called historical particularism. Historical particularism, okay. Which was less concerned about change over time and more focused on identifying distinct cultures. So these cultures were associated archaeologically with specific elements of material culture. So for example, if you were finding a particular kind of pottery, that meant that you had found evidence of a specific culture. So these theorists all believed that cultural change was a movement of ideas, so what they called cultural diffusion. So instead of societies changing over time, it was societies engaging with each other that caused culture change. So extreme version of this view of cultural diffusion was a belief that any idea had really only ever been invented once and then spread out from its point of origin. And for scholars who really believe this, for the most part, this point of origin was probably somewhere in the Middle East. So obviously this is not the case, but the identification of particular objects of material culture, especially pottery, with actual cultures, is an idea that persists, and you can still see it represented in a lot of museums, including in our own current galleries here at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. So likewise, the idea that you can trace the spread of ideas and people in the archaeological record also persists and is a valuable contribution. No, of course, today we recognize that different cultures have come up with similar ideas independently many times over the course of human existence. So part of historical particularism was the belief that every culture was completely unique and possessed of a character that could only have been formed by that culture's particular historical circumstances that it had experienced. So in North America, this was tied to the fear that Euro-American cultures would overwhelm contemporary indigenous societies, and they would simply cease to exist. And that thus there was an imperative to record as much about them as possible before they were gone. So essentially, anthropologists who held to this theory, so not archaeologists, but people who were studying at the time contemporary cultures, didn't think that indigenous cultures could survive European contact. And so it was meant to be sort of a sympathetic perspective, like, oh, we have to save these people and their ideas and their culture. But really, it contributed to views that indigenous cultures were dead or dying, and overlooked all the ways that they were persisting into the present. And so people still see indigenous cultures and traditions as things of the past. And the way that we talk about archaeological cultures can reinforce this idea. And so it's something that we need to think about consciously when we are talking about archaeology and we are talking about indigenous populations and their ancestry. Conversely, historical particularism was also linked to the rise of European nationalism in the early 20th century. So it provided support for this sort of notion of countries having deep histories that they could trace backwards in time, that these histories, this connection, could give people a sense of pride in a common and unique identity, common to themselves and then unique between other national groups. And so this could reinforce national authority over boundaries, so political boundaries. For example, you could say, well, this culture is linked to our past, and you can find these sites here, so obviously we should have control of this territory. And so they could even exert that, use those to exert authority into contested areas. So this continues to be one way in which archaeology and archaeological knowledge can be incredibly politically charged. So we do still see this kind of historical particularism and nationalism invested in archaeology. And so it's important to be aware that when we're talking about these things as theories, that they also do still have like a real impact on people's lived lives, right? So if, somebody is saying, well, there's this historical site in this particular area that's linked to our history, so therefore, we should be controlling that land, and maybe we're going to do something about it. I mean, that's a pretty direct impact. Moving away from the political aspects, when we go back to the cultural historical approach, another important sort of idea that goes along with it is functionalism, which adds the idea adds to this idea of like historical particularism and whatnot, the idea that everything that a culture has a purpose, and that purpose is to move towards a cultural unity. So this is where the idea is that we can answer questions like, what is this object for? What is its function? And the notions that things that people made have primarily practical functions as well. So ironically, this is where the fallback idea is that, if we don't know what it's for, it's probably ritual. Like, that's where this kind of comes from as well. It's the idea that if something had a non-obvious practical function, like if it wasn't a tool, for example, then it was probably religious or symbolic. So that's sort of where this thinking comes in. So there has to be a function for every particular object. And if we don't understand it, surely it's not that we just don't have the context for understanding it. It's that it has, it's not that we don't understand the practical purpose. It's clearly got some other like symbolic value. So when you combine these different approaches, this sort of historical particularism and functionalism, it's really what you still see in a lot of museums. So this is an object from this culture, and it was used for this purpose, right? So it's important to note that with these approaches, when you're talking about a culture, it's really more like a group of associated material objects and technology. So they're not really talking about people, they're talking about things as though they are people, right? So you can see technological change, but there's no sense in this period and in this approach that we can really trace how people were thinking or what meaning objects may have had beyond the functional. So a pot could be used for cooking, sure, but they wouldn't have thought about it as being sort of a representation of a shared craft that links different generations. That's not really how they were perceiving these objects. So these are really some of the big ideas that carried us into the middle of the 20th century. And really it's a debate about how cultures or technologies changed. So as I said, these are kind of cyclic ideas, they overlapped, and there's a lot more complexity to all of them. Like I said, they change in nuance, there's dialogues, people drop some of the more problematic ideas and sort of refine them as things go. But at this point, archaeology is also very much an academic discipline. It's being carried out primarily by scholars associated by universities and museums, and also by amateur enthusiasts, some of whom really are still walking that sort of antiquarian line pretty closely. By the late 40s, we're also starting to see some more refinement of field methods, with people digging in measured grids, for example. So there's that idea of just trying to be more systematic about your collections. The biggest challenge to the ideas of the culture historical period really came from processualism, which is represented in North America by what we call the New Archaeology. So these theorists thought that all these culture-based ideas about trying to figure out what people of the past were like was essentially a bunch of navel-gazing. So this idea of like grouping people into cultures based on the things that they had, we couldn't really prove any of that. So they wanted to take a much more scientific approach, to have hypotheses regarding cultures of the past, and to go into the field in order to test these ideas. So they applied the scientific approach to developing new field methods as well, taking a much more scientifically rigorous approach to not only to collecting, but also to recording. So we get the idea of like recording things in place, knowing exactly how different things are associated and so forth. They really didn't like the whole notion of cultures, the way it had been developed by the culture historical theorists. And they thought that looking at everything as a conglomeration, as opposed to the direct action of people, was losing an important nuance. So they believed that in studying archaeology, we could see the evidence of behavior and behavioral changes, not just changes in objects and technology. So they thought that by taking this approach, they could reveal objective truths about peoples of the past, and more broadly about the human condition. So this was, to some extent, also a reformulation of cultural evolutionism. So they believed that by looking at material culture, we can see how humans had adapted to their physical and social environments and how those adaptations influence behavior over time. So this is still in this period, like in the 60s and so, linked to a concept of progression from simplicity towards complexity in terms of cultural development. But there's more exception, they are more accepting of the idea that different cultural changes can be introduced through contact or through diffusion. So as in previous iterations, like that was a big debate. Like it was either this or this. And at this point, the processualists are willing to admit that cultural diffusion is something that does actually happen. You do have influence between cultures where they meet. And as I said, like this is one of the ways that we can see how these are cyclic ideas. So they come back. So the big response to processualism is what we call post-processualism. So it was strongly influenced by other theoretical approaches that were going on in sort of intellectual thinking circles at the time, including postmodernism. So in post-processualism, theorists started to question the notion that the scientific approach was either the best or even the only approach to knowledge. So it was really about recognizing that scientific approaches are not actually free from bias, that researchers they're carrying their own biases into their work. So for example, feminist and gender archaeology gets categorized often with post-processualists because they're focused on calling out sexist bias in interpretations that people are taking into the field and they're trying to claim that they have this complete scientific objectivity, but at the same time their own experiences are blinding them to different possibilities. So the post-processualists wanted to sort of break that apart. So archaeological fieldwork is also destructive. I know I've talked about this a little bit in the past, that you're digging things up, you can't put it back. It's not really possible to actually replicate what happens in the field the way you can in a scientific experiment in a lab, right? So the post-processualists also thought it was really kind of foolish to pretend that it was possible to really be scientific about fieldwork and about how archaeology was being practiced. So the post-processualist approach also valued other perspectives more than other previous theoretical approaches had. So it promoted the idea of talking to non-specialists or non-archaeological specialists, of examining and valuing oral history and cultural knowledge, as well as other avenues of insight. So it recognized that the behavior we see in the archaeological record was carried out by individual actors who may or may not have been reflective of greater patterns that could be ascribed to a larger group of individuals. So maybe when we're looking at like the evidence of a particular behavior in the archaeological record, maybe it was done because that's how everybody else had done it, right? But maybe the person who did this one thing that we're seeing was having a bad day, or they were mad at somebody, or they were just bored. So there's no way of pulling apart those like particular experiences and knowing whether or not you're seeing is actually a broader pattern or not. So for the post-processualists, everything was subjective, so it was based on individual experiences rather than objective, so like representing an actual like grand truth of some kind. So this perspective also recognized that there was power inherent in claiming scientific authority that can silence marginalized groups like indigenous populations whose ancestors were the subjects of archaeological investigations. So there was, again, this challenge to academic authority that came with this sort of post-processualist approach. So notably, most of the big thinkers in post-processualism were actually European thinkers. So there was a lot more international dialogue by this period, which is something I mentioned previously. So the ideas certainly spread, and they had a huge impact on how people thought about archaeology in North America. But the field practice had really already been very strongly transformed by the processualists, and that really kind of stuck. So one of the responses we saw to the idea that we can't really be completely scientific in the field was not so much to give up the attempt, but just to try and take better notes, to keep those records more clear about how and why different decisions are being made, and what the basis for those is, right? So, okay, where are we now? And that's kind of difficult to answer. There continues to be advances in schools of thought, but post-processualism really cracked open the notion of authority in archaeology and in academia more broadly. So it helped bring about a more reflective context when it comes to colonial power, for example, and authority, and how it impacts academic work. So recognizing that institutions like universities and museums serve to reinforce colonial power and knowledge systems. So how we know knowledge and how we value how that knowledge is obtained can, like I said, it can be used to silence other ways of knowing. It gives that voice of authority that speaks over other people who might have different perspectives that are that biases that people who are conducting this kind of academic work might have personal biases that don't allow them to understand those different perspectives, and so they just get sort of lost. So I would argue that this sort of challenge to academic authority is a good thing overall, but there's still a lot of larger consequences that we're still seeing played out today, and part of that is that idea that any different perspective is as valuable as another, and therefore we don't need to listen to academic authorities, that there's no value in it at all. And that's not really where they were trying to go necessarily with that. So before these different post-processual ideas came along and introduced the idea of subjectivity of knowledge, there was this idea that really only one theory could be actually right? So people aligned themselves with different schools of thought for life, essentially. And then they would teach their own students this, and so it just sort of made this sort of almost these chains of genealogical chains of information and schools of thought. So today, there's more recognition that you can learn from lots of different approaches, and it's important to be aware of bias and to respect other knowledge systems. However, we have pulled back out of some of the more extreme responses that were down some of these more extreme roads where post-processualism led, where we didn't think it was possible to know anything at all. So we still value a scientific approach, especially in the field, but we recognize that it's not possible to be completely objective. So we can aim for that, but we have to recognize that we can't actually achieve it. So we value advances in technology as well that allow us to try new and less destructive field methods, with the view that maybe we will get to a point where we can extract information from an archaeological site but leave artifacts and features intact, which would mean that other people could go back to the field and try different approaches there as well. But really, once some people had accepted the value of having multiple perspectives, it was harder to pull back to this idea of there being one single objective truth. So we've tended to see a proliferation of different theories and perspectives instead of these different silos of thought that we had previously. So another part of why there hasn't been a major swing in theoretical approaches in a while is that archaeology has moved out of being a purely academic exercise. So this is where we come back to sort of the professionalization. So we started with the antiquarians, we moved into sort of the academic performance of archaeology, but we've really moved past that now. So I've talked about how in Ontario, most archaeology is actually being done by cultural resource management companies. This is also true in other places where heritage laws value the preservation of the material past, so it's become an industry. So doing archaeology as a business, however, doesn't really give a lot of time to invest in these different theoretical approaches, especially if you have to write reports that are standardized and submit them to clients who don't necessarily have a nuanced idea of archaeology, or even to agencies who are reviewing your work in terms of compliance with different regulations, right? So the how and why this archaeological information is being produced is different. So there's not as much time, like if you're having to write to a deadline, you have a project that you need to complete, there's not as much time to sort of give the sort of in-depth thought about how and why things are being done, what kind of knowledge is being produced, right? So because of this, there has become something of a divide between practicing CRM archaeologists and academics. So academic archaeologists who are interested in theory, which is not all of them, many of them don't have any interest in sort of exploring these, how we are actually thinking about things, how we're producing knowledge, but they have more time and resources to devote to it. So there's constantly new perspectives being developed that help us think more about the archaeological record and how we can learn more from it. However, in many cases, CRM archaeologists who have a lot more of might have more of a duty to consult with indigenous populations, for example, because of different regulations. Or they might have to like keep in mind like other powers and influences that are engaging with their work, right? So this also provides a point of access for new voices and new interpretations and a broader sharing of knowledge. And they're also just doing more archaeology, right? So they're seeing more trends in the field and in the lab and collecting more materials than their academic counterparts are. Like they're just doing more work. So in some ways they just have a lot more experience with archaeology than anybody who's in an academic position. So one of the things that we're trying to do at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology is to sort of help bridge that gap by making the materials and reports that are generated by CRM available to academic archaeologists. And so while it's not really possible yet to reconduct fieldwork, the notes and reports that are generated in the field can be used to help understand original context, to sort of maybe not physically reconstruct them, but to sort of give a better idea of what those original contexts were like, right? So the archaeological record, which is the artifacts as well as a document, can still be used for new research and examined from different theoretical perspectives in academia, as well as being accessible to knowledge seekers from other kinds of contexts as well. And that's something that we at the museum find really valuable and that we'd like to help promote, this idea of dialogue between CRM and academia, and this ability to sort of recontextualize old knowledge in new ways as well, to help get more different perspectives and different ideas and a richer, more complex understanding of the peoples of the past. So I hope that gives people who maybe don't have a lot of background in archaeology, just again, that idea of how complex these thoughts have been, how you're seeing those things presented in museums and other places, and just the idea that it's not static either, that what we know about the past and how we understand it, how we're even asking questions and what those questions are will change over time. So it's not a matter of we know something, that's the absolute truth, and then we move on from it. There is more to be learned, a more rich and more richness and depth to be pulled out of the knowledge that we think we already have. So thank you for joining me. On Thursday, I believe I'm going to be giving you a talk on Bishop's Block, which is a major excavation that was conducted in 2007 by Archaeological Services, Inc. And then we have that collection at the museum. We have some good virtual resources on it. So I'm hoping to be able to share some of those with you and to give you a little bit of a background on what some of these big, urban archaeological projects can look like. So I hope you'll join me then, and I hope you'll have a great day. So thank you.